Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mike Posner. I direct the Center for Business and Human Rights at NYU Stern School of Business. Today, we're going to be talking about, the title of this is Spreading the Big Lie, How Social Media Sites Have Amplified False Claims of U.S. Election Fraud, which is the title of a report that we put out earlier this month. A few words about the center. We're started in 2013. We're the first human rights center at a business school, and we've looked at a whole range of issues relating to global supply chains, migrant labor, the S and ESG investments, gaps in diversity in the investment sector. And since 2017, when Paul Barrett joined the center, we've put a big focus on human rights issues relating to social media platforms and how social media the social media industry is affecting our democracy, in particular relating to what we call harmful content or disinformation. Paul joined the center in 2017 as the deputy director. He worked for 3 decades as a journalist, both with the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg Business Week. He's written 4 nonfiction books covering a range of topics, and he's now produced close to a dozen reports on these very important social media issues for our center. And we're delighted to have him joined today by Katie Harbath, who is the founder and chief executive of Anchor Change, a consultancy group that helps clients address civic and tech policy issues. She's also affiliated with the International Republican Institute, the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Integrity Institute, and the Atlantic Council. Katie, delighted to have you with us. For 10 years, from 2011 to 2021, Katie worked at Facebook, where she was assembled a team of about 30 people globally responsible for managing election-related issues. The role included working with product teams to develop civic engagement, election integrity products, including political advertising transparency, and developing and executing policies around elections, and serving as a spokesperson for the company on those issues. So, Katie, it's great to have you with us. And we're also delighted to have Liza Dwoskin, who's a Washington Post reporter. She's been their Silicon Valley correspondent since 2016, focusing on social media and the power of the tech industry in a democratic society. Before that, Liza worked for the Wall Street Journal, was their first beat reporter covering big data, and also previously worked for Bloomberg Business Week. So welcome to all of you, and I'm going to hand over to Paul. This should be a great session.
Well, thanks, Mike. Really appreciate it, and I'm grateful to everybody who has joined us today, and especially to Liza and to Katie. The report that we put out recently has several main findings, and I think I'll sprint through those really quickly. We'll put a few quick slides up, and then I'll turn things over to Liza to ask some questions and guide the discussion. The main findings of our report, Spreading the Big Lie, are first the foundation, which is that the big lie that Joe Biden did not legitimately win the 2022 election has now metastasized into an article of faith in the Republican Party that elections in the United States are generally corrupt. This is taking shape as GOP nominees for state and federal office, particularly in key swing states like Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, have elevated this falsehood to a central campaign theme in the 2020 midterms, which of course are coming up in just a short time in November. Social media platforms have promised to protect the upcoming elections and democracy in general from mis and disinformation, but we've found that their flawed policies and inconsistent enforcement practices result in the continued amplification of election denialism, especially in those key battleground states which will, in all likelihood, decide the presidential election in 2024. Some examples of problems with what the main social media platforms are doing include Facebook's continued exemption of politicians from its fact-checking program, which facilitates election denial lies by very influential public figures, namely candidates for and incumbents in political office. Twitter has a reasonable sounding civic integrity policy, as they call it, but they turn this policy on and off, actually having put it in hiatus in March 2021 and not reactivating it until August of this year, a practice which allows phenomena like election denialism to gain momentum because politics are actually a 365-day-a-year undertaking. TikTok, whilst considered by many still to be a haven for teenage dance fads, in fact has become a home for a great deal of political communication. The very fast-growing platform has announced tough-sounding policies related to elections, but their enforcement has been very haphazard, as I can explain in more detail as we move along. YouTube, meanwhile, has allowed its very popular long-form video platform to be exploited by proponents of disinformation, such as the myth of widespread so-called ballot trafficking, as portrayed in the debunked movie 2000 Mules. These are not problems in the abstract. They have very specific consequences. And I'll mention just a few of those, and then we'll get going with the discussion. First, and most broadly, of course, the spread of this kind of falsehood undermines trust in elections and in democratic institutions in general. And we saw the awful manifestation of that on January 6th, 2021. More as well, you see that the big lie and related falsehoods are being used to justify the enactment of restrictive voting laws in quite a few states. And these restrictive laws are disproportionately harming, or have the potential to disproportionately harm, people of color. Falsehoods about elections are also fueling harassment and even death threats aimed at election administrators and workers, causing many experienced officials to make plans to leave their jobs before the 2024 presidential election. A prospect that could end up causing snafus with election procedures, which would then, of course, in kind of a terrible feedback loop, only fuel more conspiracy theories about what's wrong with elections in the first place. And finally, if even a handful of Republican election deniers in swing states are elected this year in the midterms to state offices that oversee presidential elections, the 2024 process could descend into chaos that make 2020 and 2021 seem tame by comparison. We don't have to see a sweep of elections by proponents of election disinformation for there to be an effect. All you need is a few secretaries of state in a few key states to not basically enforce the intent of voters when it comes time to tallying votes and electoral college votes. And we could have a situation that really breaks down beyond anything we saw in the last presidential election. So I think I'll leave it there for the moment. We make some recommendations in the report as well, which I can come to later on. And now I'll ask Liza Dwoskin of the Washington Post to guide the conversation for the next period. Thanks, Liza.
Thank you so much for having me, Paul and NYU. Paul and Katie are the best people to think with on all of these issues, I find, as I've covered this stuff for the last number of years, 6 years now. And so my first question will be to Katie. Paul, I love this report because you underscore, as you said, that the big lie is, now thousands of little lies. It cannot be put back in the box, and it's become a truism for a large portion of the electorate. And what you underscore is that tech platforms have played a massive role in that post January 6th. I feel there was a lot of conversation in the run-up about Stop the Steal in the run-up to January 6th, and we've done a lot of reporting about the role they played on January 6th, but much less about this continued drip of big lie and little lies and how that's impacted the public ever since. As you point out, YouTube is the only platform that even affirmatively says since the election that it would be affirmatively removing election falsehoods. And as you point out, the enforcement has been a total mess, and we'll get into that. So my first question, though, is to go to Katie and ask, do you agree with the essentially the central contention of the report, which is that, if I'm understanding it correctly, that the tech platforms have continued culpability for the ongoing spread of the big lie in the population and among elected officials? And do you agree with the recommendation that they should actually be not labeling the stuff or downranking the stuff, but just simply removing it on the grounds that spreading lies about an outcome of a democratic election should not be on these platforms?
Yeah, well, first, thank you for having me. It's such a great discussion to be having, and there's so much nuance to really dig into here. I think first and foremost, do the tech companies have a role and have a responsibility in how this stuff is being spread? Absolutely. But I think the fault, first and foremost, does actually lie with the candidates and those that are saying it and continue to say it. And I think us as a society have not yet figured out traditionally political speech is amongst the most protected, and particularly that from candidates is amongst the most protected. And we haven't really, at least as I can remember, I'm not that old, I'm only in my 40s, that we've seen this type of situation where we have this tension between protecting that speech and the harm that can come from spreading lies about things such as 2020. So there's definitely a role there. I think an area where the report, and I do want to dig into a bit more, and I was kind of, as you were going through it, Paul, I was looking back at the recommendations, and I think is an area that we really need to get into is the difficulty of enforcing on these policies. So there's the question of, do we agree with the policies? Do we agree that politicians shouldn't be have a penalty for being fact checked on the platform? Should it be demoted? Should it be labeled, et cetera? But it's really challenging to find all these. And when you start having more and more candidates spreading out, there are still the chances that there is fraud that happens in elections. There's the chances that some things might go wrong, that there might have to be recounts, that those things can happen. That makes it even more challenging to just assume that will be nothing that goes wrong. And so how do you know the difference between where they're lying, but there's something actually happening? So I'd love to dig into all that a bit more. But Lizzie, you also asked me, I do feel uncomfortable with just outright taking it down.
Yeah, if it is false, let's say the election has been called and then a candidate comes and says, I don't believe these results are not true. In the
That's
case
actually fair. If you can get, so that what I immediately get to is, oh my God, how do I enforce that and keep track of every single state and county level election commission and when they certify the elections, and how do you determine that? So forgive me, that's where my brain immediately went, was the enforcement and the scale, doing it not just in the US at every level, but then thinking about that globally. So that's why I also had anxiety of like, oh my gosh, how would we execute on that? But I do think, like, in our ideal world, if I can wave a magic wand and figure out a way to do that, I do think if we can define when an election has been certified, it's gone through the courts, you have like standards like that, that then if something's happening, I think I'd be more open to potentially taking it down.
But it sounds like you're saying, and I want Paul to chime in, it sounds like you're saying you don't really think that's doable. Like, Paul is recommending that they should do this as a policy. I hear you saying it's not even practically doable.
They can write the policy. I just think that it's going to be incredibly challenging to do it well and at scale. And that's what we're seeing now with the challenges that Paul wrote in the report. And that, you know, it was a lot of, they have these policies, they have these strong sounding policies, but they're having challenges in actually enforcing it is one challenge. There's also just the political challenge these companies face with the chance that Republicans are going to come into power in the House. That means there will be real political challenges potentially. I don't know if it'll actually turn into legislation, but hearings, reputational challenges, other things that could come into that I think play into a lot of this. And I think frankly too, a lot of them they never got into this business to have to make some of these calls. And I think there's a little bit of a game of chicken being played of, okay, government, regulate this, or let's see what happens in the Supreme Court to try to give them some cover on some of these decisions they make, because they're really between a rock and a hard place, because they're going to get yelled at by all sorts of different directions, no matter what decision that they make.
Paul, what do you think?
Well, I mean, Katie raises a lot of very reasonable, practical, problems and complications. I want to grant right out of the bat that enforcement of policies in this area, just like enforcement of any policies that might have to do with hate speech or, pornography or harassment, is extremely difficult at the scale at which these platforms operate. With in most cases, not Twitter, but in case of Meta's platforms and YouTube and now TikTok, in excess of a billion regular users posting billions of pieces of content collectively a day. So you have to grant that this is a huge technological challenge and a huge just sort of policy challenge. How do you do this in a fair way? Granted. I guess there are a couple of responses though to acknowledging that difficulty. One is if the platforms are making that argument, gosh, this is just really hard to do. You grant that and you say, yes, but here's the thing: you guys set up this system. You went for growth. You went for adding users kind of at top velocity. And unfortunately, in the years as you were building these systems and bringing all of these, hundreds of millions and now more than a billion a piece users in, the necessary guardrails and systems and even thought as to how to superintend the system was not being put in. Now, we have 2016, a very startling development of Russia, interfering with a U.S. presidential election via social media platforms, and a lot of serious thinking has gone on all throughout society, including at the platforms, as to how to respond much more vigorously to these problems. But in a lot of ways, the platforms, by that point, were already sort of behind the trend, behind the eight ball even, and making it difficult to catch up and difficult to figure out how to put the right systems in place. So I grant that the challenge is huge, but it's the company's responsibility to come up with a solution. And I think a better solution than what we have now. On the issue of removal, I agree that total removal of content should be a last resort, but it doesn't mean that, as we explained in the report, that the content needs to disappear completely so that no one can see it. We've suggested that the platforms could basically have a library of removed material that's marked as having been removed with an explanation for why it was taken down, and have it in such a status that it can't be spread at all by anybody. But Liza, you could go and look at it for purposes of journalism. Scholars could look at it for purposes of their social science studies, and ordinary people could look at it to educate themselves, but it would cease being disseminated. So removal is not necessarily meaning that you erase the content.
Have you had conversations about that, about doing something like an archive like that with the tech companies? Is it something they think?
I have talked about it with them, and I think that there is an understandable reluctance to be in the position of taking down content altogether, although it does happen. I mean, whole accounts are removed at times, and large swaths of material, for example, content from QAnon, was removed. Many, tens of thousands of accounts were removed from the main platforms. I think the thing to emphasize is actually, removing content is not a foreign thing to the social media platforms. If you violate their policies, which are very elaborate and there are a lot of do's and don'ts, your content gets removed routinely. The tricky part comes when you're talking about something being true or not true, and I acknowledge that's a difficult distinction to make. But if something is defined as hate speech, it gets removed. That's not really controversial in the world of social media self-regulation. What we're advocating is that approach be expanded to include disinformation and misinformation about crucial aspects of democratic practice and democratic norms, which doesn't mean that every passing silly or incorrect comment by a politician or by an activist would be taken down. There would, of course, have to be selectivity, as there's selectivity now across all of the categories that the platforms enforce against. A final thought on what Katie said, that the platforms may be hesitating because they're worried about political ramifications. I think that's very true. I mean, in fact, I know it's true because I've had people who are currently at the platforms say it to me off the record that, gosh, if we get into the business of taking down a lot of material on the far right, and then Republicans, come into power in Washington, we're going to have political problems. That's true, but this is simply a hazard that the platforms are going to have to grapple with. It's not brand new, and it can't be an excuse for not enforcing policies on the books in a vigorous way.
Look, what we do I know that it is hard to police every possible lie and the nuances of those lies. And is it a politician saying it? Is it an everyday person saying it? One thing I will say is at the Post, we have a database of election denial candidates in the US. And I don't think it would be that hard for the platforms to create such a database in any country where there's a major election, where you can identify the main candidates that might be spreading election fraud. Let's just focus on the US because it's a big narrative here right now. Go through those, I think we have 300 something candidates in our database. And, certainly these large tech companies have enough enforcement power to task people not to necessarily cover the whole waterfront, but just to look at those 300 and what they say after their election, because they've already said they're going to contest their election. And we all know that a lot of these little lies and big lies are spread through influencers. So it's less important to tackle a small account with no following. It's more important to tackle these 300 that are political candidates, and we have already set the stage for those lies. So I feel like there's more enforcement that could be done. I also want to dive in on YouTube, because I want to dive in on each of the companies, but particularly YouTube, because they've had this they're the one that's actually had this strong policy in place, and yet your report says that the enforcement has been terrible. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. YouTube has managed, for reasons that are not 100% clear to me, to fly below the radar in these debates. Part of the reason for that, I suppose, is that it's harder to analyze video content than it is text content. So social scientists who have done studies have paid less attention to YouTube. I think journalists and civil society people have paid less attention to YouTube because we're also fixated on Twitter, because that's the platform that we use and we keep an eye on. And I think Facebook was the big kahuna initially, so it gets lots of attention. And even though YouTube is by some definitions the most popular social media platform out there, not just in the United States, but in other countries like India, Russia, and elsewhere, it has escaped the same kind of scrutiny. The problem is, I think, with YouTube is you have to look at the details. And one, I think, good illustration of that is in December of 2020, YouTube announced that it would begin removing material, videos from its platform that were still contesting the 2020 election, the validity of Biden's being elected. But they enforced the policy by saying that from this day forward, we will take those videos down, and everything that's on the platform as of today, that can stay up. But of course, popular videos by influential people who have channels that have large followings on YouTube remain significant and are distributed and disseminated, not just on YouTube, but as a number of studies have shown, very widely on other platforms, and including, encrypted message platforms like Telegram and elsewhere. So YouTube has this huge influence as a depository of video material, but the enforcement of its policies are frequently, to my eye, problematic in the fashion that I just described with the example I offered.
So you're saying there's just lots of material on YouTube right now that is in violation of its policy.
Yeah, right. And I think a very good live illustration of this is this concept of ballot trafficking, which has spread across all the platforms. It's not at all unique to YouTube, which has been sort of emphasized by thought leaders within the Republican Party, and then really got a huge boost from this widely debunked movie 2000 Mules, which posits a vast conspiracy of Democratic operatives, the mules, who supposedly stuff invalid ballots into drop boxes across the country, and particularly in key swing states. A phenomenon which has occurred in a case or two with a handful of ballots here or there, but is simply not a phenomenon that is happening at a mass level. And yet that big deception has now spread to the point where you have candidates and activists calling for basically people to convene tailgate parties at drop boxes to watch for ballot mules and otherwise to have sort of civilian policing of drop boxes. And that's obviously, designed to intimidate people from using the drop boxes and using mail-in, ballots not on election day. So the ripple effect from YouTube's continuing to promote and amplify this movie 2000 Mules is having effects at the local level that I think are very, very detrimental.
You also didn't, Steve Bannon's podcast also is a major promoter of the 2000 Mules narrative, and of course, in getting an armies of poll watchers.
Yeah.
I saw that civil rights groups have actually specifically asked tech companies to police exactly calls for poll watching, for example, calls to line up at polls, all that stuff. They actually want that to not be allowed on the platforms. Katie, what do you think?
So again, I think that the hard things are, I keep going back to enforcement because I'm sort of like, how do you tell the difference between somebody asking somebody to be poll watchers versus the context of that they might be trying to disrupt those types of things that are happening. And I know when you look at individual pieces of content, it might be easier to do so than others. And part of me is sort of sitting here kind of thinking about, like, should the conversation we be having of just like the concept of a lot of these platforms just saying they're reducing the amount of political content in their feeds overall, because trying to determine the nuance between a lot of these things, maybe it's not enforceable. And Paul, you're right, they did build these platforms, and this is a very hard genie to put back into the bottle and be thinking about it. Now, outright banning everything or trying to demote it's a really hard thing to do in and of itself as well. But so I do think we need to continue to think about how we have nuanced policies on this, how we actually define this stuff, and how do we help to think through between, there's a great framework that I think Camille Francois first came up with, which was the actor behavior content model, and looking at each of those three and how do you put all three of those together when trying to determine if a piece of content is getting to the place where, like in Paul's report, says it's something that could be damaging to the overall process and should be just removed. And that's an area where absolutely the companies need to do more work. I think we need to do more work on the civil society area too, to try to make sure that there's at least we won't get full scale agreement on what those things should be, but at least some common understandings, not just across platforms, but across sort of society as a whole.
What do you think, both of you, about the effects of labeling? I mean, that's where a lot of the companies have gone, is they're saying, we're not going to remove this stuff. We're just going to label it if we think it's a false claim about an election.
I mean, Twitter's the only one that I've seen that's put out their own research on the labeling. They had a little paragraph of it in their elections one that they've seen it, I think, be effective. There's different types of labels too, right? Like Facebook has if a piece of content labeled as false, it has sort of that black screen and it has that it was false. And then there was types of labeling that did happen for candidates. One of my favorite, I shouldn't call it my favorite, but like I have the screenshot of when Donald Trump is like, I won this election, and underneath it is the label that says Joe Biden's projected to be the winner of the 2020 election. And from what I've seen from external research on that, it's been a mixed review, I think, so far on the effect of labels and what is the exact right way to help get people that information. Another thing, though, that's been more promising is trying to get ahead of these potential lies a lot more and helping voters and consumers better understand the type of stuff that they might encounter. We saw that work well with the Russian invasion into Ukraine, of trying to get ahead of some of that. And so I think there's an area of that too, of how do you try to get ahead of some of these things and try to get more authoritative information out there, as well as trying to determine who are the right messengers of that information. That, you know, if Donald Trump says X, who is it that says Y that might actually change people's minds? I don't have the answer to that right now, trying to figure that out. But I think those are important things to think about too, of how can we do some of that pre-bunking.
Yeah, I don't really disagree with anything that Katie just said. I think there is at this point sufficient outside social science showing that certain approaches to identifying and trying to correct falsehoods are helpful in encouraging people to at least rethink, whether to believe a given piece of content. So I think, continuing to experiment with that and combining labeling with the practice of demoting the piece of content in question in people's feeds, which doesn't take it completely out of circulation, but just means that fewer people, as a practical matter, are going to see it, seems to me to be a reasonable approach with certain types of mis and disinformation, particularly where there's likely to be kind of a dispute. But the process, for example, that Facebook goes through is fairly elaborate. This is not like a sort of a snap decision. They actually refer content, potentially false content, to outside fact-checking organizations, which do journalistic style inquiries into whether things are correct or not, and come up with a determination. This is not by any means a panacea. I'm not suggesting that approach that Facebook has undertaken, by the way, to a much greater degree than the other platforms have, is a cure-all for the problems we're talking about. It's not. Nothing here is a cure-all. We're never going to completely keep up with the flow of false information. The point is to make a good faith effort, and even in making that effort and making distinctions, helping people who are not necessarily on the platforms to point out that that up is not down and black is not white. Participating in that effort, as opposed to saying we're overwhelmed, we can't really participate in that effort, I think is important. Let me pause here just to encourage our attendees, if they have their own questions, to put them in the chat, and we'll try to choose from a few of those in a few minutes around 12:45. So we really encourage people to add their own questions here. Liza, back to you.
Yeah, please do. We really would love to hear the questions. No, Paul, that you actually led right into, I was going to say, we're a month away from the midterms. It's right around the corner. So I was going to ask you what should they be doing? What can be done? Can you just tick, you've already started in that direction. Tick off a few things. What should be done within the next month?
Right. Well, a month is not a long period of time. And I think most of the, it'll be difficult to get a lot done in just the period between now and early November. Trying to consistently and persistently enforce policies that are already on the books is obviously the place to start. More broadly, and this is not going to solve anything for the midterm elections, I think the starting place for all these reforms is greater disclosure by the platforms of how their automated systems rank, recommend, and remove content, and how these automated systems interact with the human beings who review content. A big part of the problem in this whole debate, and a big part of the big reason why a lot of the debate has kind of a vague tenor to it, is that we know so little about how the internal systems work. If social scientists, knew more about how algorithms made your feed different from my feed, and understood how certain types of falsehoods go viral, whereas others fade and become inconsequential, it is altogether possible that we would come up with better, more specific recommendations. The companies themselves would then have an incentive to try to get ahead of criticism and ahead of outside suggestions by coming up with their own reform proposals. But right now, this whole arena is basically dark. We don't really know what's going on. And as has been proposed in a number of pieces of legislation in Congress, none of which have gone anywhere, I think we need a great deal more disclosure, and I would say voluntary disclosure by the platforms. I'd be very curious to hear Katie's thought on that. In addition, just to name a couple of other ideas, I think that some type of independent auditing process whereby outside third parties could check whether the platforms are weighing the intended benefits of the services they're offering against potential risks, and describe how that weighing process is done, would again inform the debate in a way that would allow for more specific reform proposals. By the way, both of these ideas are central to legislation that has been enacted in the European Union, and is now just beginning to move through the process of actual enforcement policies being drafted. So this is not, these ideas are not completely out of the blue. All across Europe, the EU is now trying to move in this direction, and the companies, I think, and this will be helpful, are going to have to figure out how to adjust to these new rules in Europe. And I hope that leads to a global rethinking, and it would help a lot if the US stepped up its own efforts legislatively to keep up with what's going on in Europe. But I'd be very curious to hear Katie's thoughts on transparency and independent auditing.
Yeah, I think transparency for sure. That's like where I think if I had to pick one piece of legislation to get through, it would be that, just to start with, because I think you're right that we don't fully understand the scope of the problem, nor do we fully understand the scope of how all these different platforms play off of one another and how connected they are, because each platform does research within their own, their own platform, but many of these bad actors and others are exploiting the loopholes in different ones to try to get some of this information out. They're also using, I would also say too, with transparency, it's not just, and there's a lot of conversations be happening about who gets access to the data, what that looks like, et cetera. But you also even just look at political ad transparency. There was a recent report, a lot of streaming services are offering the level of micro-targeting that platforms like Facebook and Google have offered to political campaigns for a long time. And there's no ad transparency tools that they have. We don't know the ads that are running on there. And we know that many Republican candidates and others are using that. And so that's another area where having, the good old Honest Ads Act that has never really gone anywhere of how you try to get legislation and stuff like that on there, I think is really important. I agree with the independent audits. Many of the companies are doing this, but they're the ones hiring the independent auditors, which I think also makes people a little bit nervous, right? But one of the things that I think we're starting to see in the EU as they start to try to enforce their laws, I kind of joke that the EU is the dog that caught the regulatory car, because they now have to figure out how to actually enforce this, get the people with the right expertise to be able to look at what the tech companies are telling them and try to be able to ascertain if it's true or not. And if they're telling the whole truth, or if they're holding back on something, or if there's another angle that they should think about asking. And there just aren't that many people out there that have that sort of expertise, especially ones that are willing to leave the tech sector and go work for a government salary in Europe and other places, and also how much those regulatory agencies are being financed to get that sort of stuff as well. So I see some of those questions that I think we're going to start grappling with as well, as we do see Europe start to try to enforce some of this. But I do hope that some of the European legislation does just trickle down into the United States with some of the transparency, but we'll see if that actually happens or not.
I want to, because we're going to go to questions in a few minutes, I want to quickly go into some of the other platforms. We talked a bit about YouTube. Also, just on the note about auditing, about a month ago, my colleague Joe Men and I and Kat, we broke a big story about a Twitter whistleblower, the former head of security, who says that the company is basically a walking security disaster and 10 years behind its counterparts. But one of the most interesting pieces I learned when I reported the story is, he says Twitter is lying about spam and bots. I'm not quite sure it's that strong, but one of the elements that I learned was that Twitter has never allowed an outside auditor to view or to analyze how the degree of spam and bots on its platform and how it measures those. And this is now central to this case with Elon Musk and the takeover of the company. And you could just see if they had an outside auditor and a public report, which they say for a variety of reasons they can't do. But if they had, it would have potentially obviated a lot of problems for them. I mean, the problem is it's a black box, and then it has become a he said, she said in the biggest business court case ever. Let's take our last few minutes to talk a little bit about the other platforms, and maybe we'll have time to get to these new laws in Texas and Florida that are now likely heading to the Supreme Court. Let's talk about TikTok. TikTok has essentially banned a lot of this. All political content has kind of moved in the direction of, well, we don't want to be political, particularly on ads. Where do you think tell me about your research on TikTok, Paul. Where do you think the fault lies there?
Well, first of all, TikTok is trying to present itself to the public, is trying to market itself as a business that is devoted to entertainment and creative activities and so forth, not devoted to politics and the news. But the fact is, once you become as popular as TikTok has become, the events of the day are inevitably going to seep onto the platform, which is what has happened. And there is now a very large volume of politically oriented material on TikTok, which is not, of course, inherently problematic. It's fine as far as I'm concerned. And I think as far as the Republic is concerned, for people to record short videos talking about their political views. What is interesting and perplexing, just from the point of view of the content that's on there, is that there are a very large number of relatively young people, I found just in wandering around on TikTok, offering up earnest rehearsals of various conspiracy theories, such as the ballot trafficking 2,000 mules theory. This is a fascinating phenomenon. Again, I'm not saying that those people they may genuinely believe it. They may be sotto voce influencers who are being paid to disseminate those views, or who knows what their motivations are. But there's just a great deal of it out there. Second, while TikTok has these very strong sounding policies, the enforcement I found is extremely erratic. Early on, I tried to search for material using the search term election fraud. TikTok had banned using that search term, which I found sort of odd. Like, I'm not really sure what that accomplishes, not letting people look around for the subject of election fraud. On On the other hand, I put in the term ballot trafficking, and that, which is sort of a more focused version of election fraud theories, produces a wealth of material. So just sort of a, to my mind, a completely arbitrary, strange distinction. I called TikTok up. We talk, as I do whenever I do one of these reports, and they listen to my observations and get back to me and say, well, now we've blocked ballot trafficking too. You can't search for that either. And I said, well, that wasn't my point. I wasn't trying to encourage you not to let anybody search for ballot trafficking. I'm concerned about whether you're letting a stream of sort of palpably, demonstrably false information about alleged ballot trafficking be amplified on your platform. So I just found in my interaction with them, and they were relatively willing to go back and forth, but they seemed to be kind of casting around in a very undisciplined and not particularly rational way in deciding how to enforce these reasonable sounding policies.
Well, I'd love to dive more into that, but I know that now is the time where we'd love to hear for questions from folks.
So we've got a number of questions. Let me start with a question from Lawrence Barrett, who says, is there any explanation or even a theory as to why the political right has exploited social media far more than the left?
I mean, I'm happy to take this one first. I think that so both parties have actually used social media quite a bit over the years. In fact, I'm about to release a report any minute now, whenever it gets published on the Bipartisan Policy Center site. I've been looking back at the last 20 years of how tech has impacted elections. And actually some of the first integrity problems started with the left with Google bombing. If you remember that in the early 2000s, where we searched for miserable failure, George W. Bush's website popped up. And they were doing that. I kind of see it as some of the first integrity problems. Now, obviously, the right has taken it in a much different direction when it comes to things, particularly around 2020 and some of the election fraud and things of that nature. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is the incentive structure that the internet put into place as we started to chase clicks, small dollar fundraising, et cetera. Over time, the candidates have gotten more extreme to keep getting attention. Whether that's attention from the media, no offense, Liza, whether it's attention from clicks, from users trying to click on it, from trying to raise money, get emails, all those different types of things. And that's something I want to study a bit more of, how is that over time keep pushing people more to the extremes, and how do we rethink those incentive structures? And can we rethink those incentive structures around a lot of that? And, frankly, I think it's just they're seeing success from it, and they're winning elections, and they're raising money off of that. And we should absolutely have the conversation of whether that's right or wrong. But if your goal is to win an election, they're finding it to be working.
I'll just say quickly that I don't want to fall victim to both sidesism. I think all the research I've seen internally from Facebook and Twitter, internal research that sources have shared with me, is that their own data shows that this kind of problem is much greater on the right. And certainly various external reports, even from Paul, have shown that as well. I'll just posit as well that Donald Trump himself was a singular internet phenomenon and was able to galvanize crowds in ways that other political leaders in the United States haven't been able to. And he hasn't. He had an online army and used communication online, vitriolic misinformation, misinformation in ways that he could supercharge them because of his network. And it became a mega network for disinfo. So I actually put a lot of the blame too on just the fact that there was this leader that was this massive amplifier as well. And so you're able to surface it in ways that wouldn't otherwise be seen.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. I think Trump has had a singular corrosive effect on truth and on our ability collectively to tell the difference between truth and falsehood. And I think we should also mention in this context, and this is a general caveat to our whole discussion today, social media, of course, is not the exclusive medium through which all of this is happening. There are other crucial sources of falsehoods, and they tend to fall, well, not exclusively on the right, asymmetrically on the right. And they're well known. I mean, Fox News is a huge influence. And a lot of the content we're talking about that's on social media platforms actually originates on Fox News. It's the repurposing of Fox News clips and tirades. And there are also, I think, Lizzie, you mentioned earlier, there are podcasts, whether it's Steve Bannon or other people of that ilk. There are websites that are influential. This is not exclusively a social media phenomenon. It's a broader media phenomenon within which social media plays a crucial amplifying role. And a lot of those other sources off social media tend to be on the right more than on the left. And social science is pretty uniform on this point, that conservatives, not just in the United States, but elsewhere, have a greater appetite for misinformation and are more likely to share it than people on the political left, which doesn't mean it doesn't happen on the left. It does, but it's just an asymmetric situation. It's not proportional.
So there's a question following on that, there's a question from Megan Smith about what she describes as an outcrop of inherently biased channels that have been created in response to more fact checking and regulation on the mainstream channels. I'm assuming this is like Parler and 4chan, et cetera. And she says, what do you propose can be done to deal with those platforms and the spread of information coming from them?
So what's interesting there that, and Paul, I'd be curious your thoughts on this too, is this is where you start to get into the questions where like Apple, what will they allow on their app store? Who will, like places like Amazon Web Services and cloud services start to allow for that? You're starting to see not just apps like Parler and stuff get created, but then like video platforms like, was it Rumble? Why am I blanking on the name? Rumble that was created. They're starting to create their own, they're starting to go further down the stack to create their own infrastructure for the web to try to get around the bigger companies to do this. And I do think this is something like the vote, there's this vote happening in the IDU, why am I blanking? This week, that between like what country is going to be sort of running some of these very underlying parts of the internet that I think are going to be increasingly becoming part of those questions of how do you and where do we, how far down the stack you go in trying to, whether or not you allow certain platforms and what types of policies they have in order to be hosted on you or have access to certain web domains and other infrastructure.
Yeah, I would add to that yes, this phenomenon, sort of the migration phenomenon is underway. I think in terms of politics in this country, the encrypted messaging services like Telegram have become crucial. It's obvious, it's very difficult to know what's going on Telegram because by definition it's secret. However, the fact that that's a predictable byproduct of the mainstream platforms doing more self-regulation and there being more demands for self-regulation and possibly government regulation, it can't be an argument against trying to better police the platforms that have billions of users. A similar situation comes up in connection with crime, anti-crime enforcement. If you police the main streets of a community, won't you drive the bad guys into the shadows? To some degree, yes, but you have to establish the main part of society has to be able to operate without that type of nefarious activity. And the same thing I think goes for social media. So we have to be aware of this. We have to be aware of the fact that there aren't panacea solutions. We're not going to solve these problems 100% or even 90%, but we have to keep working at them to try to diminish their hold on our electoral system.
So shifting gears a little bit, and Katie, this one is for you. It comes from Mariana Olazola Rosenblatt, and she's asking really about the process for deciding where resources are spent to deal with this question of election integrity in the US versus other countries. She asks, is there any correlation between the investment in, let's say, content, reviewers or fact checkers and the number of users in a particular country? How does Facebook make the decision? What's the formula for deciding how many resources are spent in the United States, let's say, versus India or Brazil?
So I'm 2 years out of the I'm 2 years out of the company, so I can't say like exactly how it is today, but I can give some broad like frameworks of how sometimes the stuff is being thought through, and some things to keep in mind as well. One, in general, my team, we would start about 1.5 to 2 years out from an election, and there would be a whole risk assessment done that was looking not just how many users the different platforms had, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, the likelihood of violence from past elections, how the internet has been used in the past, the likelihood of foreign interference. There, for some of the bigger countries, particularly India and Brazil and EU and other places, on the ground research that is done to try to help determine what are the right levers to pull and resources that are needed. Brazil's elections coming up here in a few days. The first round's on October 2nd. All of the platforms have signed agreements with the TSE, the Electoral Commission down there. It's something that you've seen them all talking quite a bit about. The Kenyan election happened here in August. That was another one. But here in September, Sweden and Italy also went to elections, and there was very little that the tech companies talked about what they were doing in those elections. And both of those have seen far right candidates win. And so one of the things that I'm particularly concerned with, now I'm obviously biased from it because this was the work that I did and I loved, but like, as somebody like Mark has been focusing more on the metaverse and making those pivots, there has been some very legitimate questions about, even though they are still putting a lot of resources into it, are they still putting in enough resources? Are they going to be paying enough attention to other international elections, and not just the big ones, but smaller ones as well that can also have really big impacts on this? And I think that that continues to be a bit of a black box, not just for, frankly, Facebook. In this report that I'm going to be releasing about looking at the last 25 years, Facebook's probably done the most public speaking and stuff they've done around the world. Like the other platforms have done far less in terms of these other countries. And it's something we need to continue to be talking about, because I think way too much attention is being paid on the United States and not elsewhere around the world.
I will just chime in on that and say there's a story that my colleague Kat Zakrzewski did around the Frances Haugen documents last year that showed how dramatically under-resourced Facebook was in India for their elections. And then I'll point you to a piece I did last week. It's not about elections, but there was an audit of how Facebook policed Arabic language and Palestinian content versus Hebrew language content in the Gaza war. Facebook commissioned this external audit at the request of its oversight board during the Gaza war last year, the 2-week war. And it found that, and this is something in the Haugen documents as well, that for many of the Arabic language moderators, Arabic is spoken by, I don't know how many people around the world Arabic is spoken by, but it has many, many dialects. And specifically for Palestinian dialects, they were having moderators, Arabic language moderators, who didn't speak those dialects. And there was documentation in the Haugen report of how the company did an internal audit of its Arabic language moderators and found that the Arabic language moderators told the auditors that they understood those dialects that they were moderating. But when the auditors came in and looked, they found out they were completely wrong. So the auditors themselves didn't even realize that they were misidentifying the content. And that's just one micro example. Katie's absolutely right that Facebook has put the most resources into this. I did a piece a couple of weeks ago about from internal data from Twitter that was leaked that Twitter only had 2 full-time people working as policy experts on misinformation in 2021. Just 2 full-time people as policy experts on misinformation. There were moderators, but in terms of expertise, just 2. So just to give you perspective, Facebook probably had hundreds at that time.
We're close. We are at the hour, but if I can sneak in one last question, it combines two, and it's really about the subject is how do we better educate the public and users on all of this? And this is from Juan Pablo Geraldo and Dorothy Bauman-Pauley. Dorothy's question is, are there measures that companies could take that they're not taking to make citizens more resilient and not as easily inclined to believe the big lies? Are there things that companies could be doing to make users better informed? And I guess, Katie, maybe start with you and we'll end with Paul.
Yeah, I think you're seeing them try to do a lot of that with, all of them talked in their announcements. I did a graph kind of looking at all the different things they talk about, and they all talk about trying to help people to register to vote, to get more information about where to vote, about the voting process, things of that nature, to try to get more of that type of information out there. But I think, again, one of the things I'm trying to tackle in some of my research and stuff too is trying to figure out who are the right messengers of that information, and if it's even right that is the tech companies doing it making any difference, or do we need to be thinking about other influencers, celebrities, others that we need to be bringing in as part of this process to try to do some of that pre-bunking and trying to get ahead of it?
Great. Paul, last word.
I agree with that and would add that this is a situation where I think the responsibility is shared. It's not exclusively on the shoulders of these companies. They could do more, but our society should be doing more, beginning with our educational system and teaching, beginning in early grades, how to distinguish between information that's worth absorbing and information that is best set to one side. I think is something we need to do a lot more of in our schools. This is done systematically in some Scandinavian countries. There are models for how to do this. It would be more difficult in our vast heterogeneous society than it would be, say, in Finland. But still, we need to begin moving down that road. So I think we all have to take some responsibility for educating ourselves on how to interpret social media and media across the board.
Great. Great session. I have a feeling we're not done talking about these subjects. I want to thank you, Liza, for great moderating. Thank you, Katie, for being with us. Thank you, Paul. And thank everybody on this Zoom call for being part of the session. We are adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.